Hey guys, this is Ron. So we've talked about tuples a little bit because they've come up in conversation when returning values from some of the methods that were built into the dictionary, for instance. But we never really explained what the tuple was all about. So in this video, we'll talk about tuples, but in order to understand tuples, we're going to have to talk about lists again. So if you remember from before, lists were pretty simple to build. So I had something like this: test equals, in my square brackets, I'm going to specify some values, right? And I can easily address any one of those values with its index number. So index 0 refers to the very first position, which currently holds a 1. So if I change that to a 5, I've modified the list. And when I did a dir on test, I had all of these methods that I can use: append, extend, insert, pop, remove, reverse, sort. So all of these allowed me to manipulate or change these values in some way, right? So the word that we refer to that as is mutable. We say that a list is mutable because it can be changed. Even after it's created, we're able to change it. Now, a tuple is the opposite. It is immutable. Once you create it, you cannot change it, or you should not be able to change it, right? So in order to build a tuple, we'll do a test tuple, and instead of using square brackets, we use the rounded ones, right? And we can specify 1, 2, 3. So we can build it almost just the same way as we did a list. When I do a type on test tuple, I get a tuple. When I do a dir on test tuple, you'll notice I only have count and index. So although it holds values just like the list did, I don't have nearly as much control over it in order to modify those values. So let's see what happens when I attempt to change the values. So I'll address it just like I did my list, and this time I'll try to set it to 15. And in this case, it's going to tell me that the tuple object does not support item assignment. Okay, so why would I create a value that I can't change? Well, it comes down to where and how you want to use a tuple. So in the case of a list, for instance, and this is one of the dirty truths about lists that we didn't necessarily discuss, is lists can do some funny things when trying to copy their contents. So we had test, right? Let's say I wanted test 2, and I want to copy the values from test into test 2. So test 2 now also holds 5, 2, and 3. The problem is when I go to change one of them. So we'll create, this is 15. So it did in fact change to 15, 2, and 3. The problem is my original test changed as well. And that's because when I copied this, instead of copying the values, it copied the memory address. So now both test 2 and test refer to the same point in memory. And so if you change either one of these, it changes both of them. And that's not the functionality we would want if we were, say, passing our list into a function. Now, we haven't necessarily discussed functions yet, but imagine that I have this code block that does this specific action for me, right? So I'm going to send it a list. It's going to do something with that list and send me some type of result, right? Maybe it's adding them together, maybe it's squaring them, I don't know. It's doing something to the data and then returning some type of result. Now, if that inside that function, I were to make a change to the list, as I'm processing that list, I might find it easier to remove certain values or combine certain values. What we don't want is that even though I get my result back, it changed the original list that I sent it, right? So I didn't mean to change it, but somehow in the function itself, the way that I processed it, I made a change and the original list is now affected. And that's a problem. I've run into that multiple times where I didn't intentionally change a list. I thought I was working with a local copy inside that function, but because they referred to the same memory address, I ended up changing both my list inside the function and my list outside of that function. So there's some funky things then that you have to do in order to negate that property from happening, or that kind of behavior, right? So here I'll recreate test2. So now that I've recreated it, they refer to two different points in memory. So we had test and we have test2, and they refer to two different points in memory. And so I could do something like this: for x in test, test2.append x. So now I have essentially taken every value in test, and one by one I copied them into x and then appended them to test2. So test2 now also contains 15, 2, and 3. But because they refer to two different points in memory, now I can do a test2 0, set this thing back to 1, check test2, it is 1, 2, and 3, check test, and it's still 15, 2, 3. So now they've been kind of decoupled, if you will. So again, there's definitely things I have to take into consideration, and there are other ways of copying one list into another, but that's a pretty easy one, and that's one that you already know how to do. So again, there's considerations we have to take with lists. Tuples, on the other hand, you don't have to take those into consideration because you can't change the tuple. So a tuple is a perfect mechanism to pass data from one section of your program into, say, a function that processes that data and then returns something. Because even if it modifies the result or tries to modify the tuple within that function, one, you can't change the tuple, but two, you don't have to worry about it changing your original data, which is why you'll find functions or methods, when they return tuples or when they return values, they'll either return single values or they'll return a tuple of values, because again, you don't have to worry about things changing. When you're passing data into a function, you either pass it in as single values, or again, you pass it in as a tuple, because you don't have to worry about accidentally changing your original data. So again, the two kind of buzzwords, if you will, that we use are mutable and immutable. Lists are mutable because they can be changed. Tuples are immutable because they cannot be changed after being created. So I hope that you see that, okay, tuples aren't this advanced concept, but we'll see them in our code quite a bit, and you'll use them in your code quite a bit because of the fact that you can't change them. Now, I could create a tuple called test. I could give it some values. I can't change these values, but I can assign whole new values. And if you want to think of it this way, I'm just again it's as if I'm creating a whole new variable, a whole new memory address. So I'm not really changing the tuple, as if I'm creating a whole new tuple. So that's kind of different. And you might also see something like this. Tuples always assume that there's going to be two values in here. So Python won't be able to figure out here if you're just trying to put brackets around this thing because you're doing some mathematical operation and so you want to preserve the order of operations. Well, Python can't figure that out necessarily. Well, I guess it can, but look here. If I do a type on test, it's now an integer. It's not a tuple. So even though it did an error, it didn't do what I wanted. It didn't create a tuple with one value. To get around that, you just append a comma on the back end and don't specify the second one. So now I have test, but test is a tuple, right? So now I can work with it as if it was a tuple. So again, you'll see this from time to time where some method is expecting a tuple to be passed into it. So if you only want to pass in one value, you're still going to have to specify a tuple, and to do that, you'll use this comma without anything, following it. And so Python will know, well, okay, so you're trying to build a tuple there. I'll create it as a tuple object and pass it into whatever method is expecting that tuple. So again, I hope you got something out of this. I hope you see the reason why we might use tuples. Some other programs, they might refer to this functionality as a constant or something along that line. I try not to refer to tuples as that. A tuple is a tuple. If you know when and where to use a tuple, tuples make sense. I try not to refer to them as constants, like maybe you want to keep track of the days of the week. Well, the days of the week never change. It's always Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, so on and so forth. So people used to create a constant called weekdays or something like that. You could do the same thing with the tuple, but again, I try not to refer to them as constants because they're tuples, right? So again, I appreciate you watching. Hope you got something out of it, and I look forward to the next portion of our tutorial.